Okay, hi everyone. It's 1 o'clock and we'd like to get started. So welcome to recording how to record the police legally and safely. It's our webinar and we've got quite a few people online with us and we're pretty excited about that. And we've got some wonderful smart speakers for you all. Thank you so much for joining, excuse me, for joining us. I'm gonna occasionally do some screen shares so that we can I can show you some things that we're going to be talking about and actually to help the webinar go along visually. So we've got some screen shares, so bear with us. In the last email that I sent out, I sent some of the documents that we'll talk about today, which is the NYU First Amendment Watch Citizens Guide, an article by one of our speakers, Sophia Cope from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and an article, a recent one, about an incident in downtown San Jose by Mercury News reporter Robert Salonga. So those three links were in the last email that you received, along with the Zoom link. So if you want to access those, we'll be referring to those. But thank you everyone for joining us. There's a lot of interest in this webinar, and I think we have about almost 200 people registered. So a lot of interest in this work, and we hope we can share a lot of good information with you about this topic. So I'm going to screen share quickly. So I'm going to talk quickly about, did that screen change for everyone? Yeah. So I'm Halima Kazem. I'm an investigative journalist and a filmmaker. I specialize in human rights and social justice issues, and I teach at San Jose State University in the journalism school and in the human rights minor. I'm the coordinator of the human rights journalism program at SJSU's new Human Rights Institute, so you'll see more of this type of work from us. And I've been a journalist for 25 years, and I love what I do. And my focus really is based on a lot of my research work and field work, primarily covering Afghanistan for almost a decade and reporting on conflict and war-ridden countries. So we also have Professor Stephen Solomon. Stephen Solomon is the Marjorie Dean Professor of Journalism at New York University and the director of the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. His latest book, Revolutionary Dissent: How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech, explores how the political protest of the nation's founding period gave meaning to the freedoms of speech and press at a time when it was a crime to criticize the government. It was named Legal Book of the Year by the law blog Concurring Opinions. Steve is currently working on a book that will tell the story of how America's founders protected individual rights and liberties in the new republic they had created. Steve teaches First Amendment law and is the founding editor of NYU's First Amendment Watch, which provides news, commentary, and legal and historical context on current conflicts over freedom of expression. The website and its teaching materials are being used in hundreds of college classrooms around the country. So welcome, Steve Solomon. Sophia Cope is a senior staff attorney on the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Civil Liberties team, working on a variety of free speech and privacy issues. She has been a civil liberties attorney for over 15 years and has experience in both litigation and policy advocacy. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Slate, and Huffington Post. Prior to joining the FF, Sophia spent 8 years in Washington, D.C. She worked at the Newspaper Association of America, now called the News Media Alliance, on freedom of the press and digital media issues, with a focus on protecting journalists' confidential sources. She advocated for a federal shield law, a warrant for content requirement under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and improvements to the Freedom of Information Act. Sophia was also an adjunct professor of media law for nearly 4 years, teaching Washington area undergrad communication and journalism students. Welcome, Sophia. Robert Salonga is a criminal justice reporter with the Mercury News, his hometown newspaper in San Jose. He attended UCLA from 2000 until 2004 and technically earned a bachelor's degree in history, but spent most of that time reporting and editing for the Daily Bruin, graduating as news editor. He later attended the University of Maryland, College Park, and earned a master's degree in journalism through a fellowship with the Washington Post. And while in the Washington, D.C. area, reported on defense and Congress for a newswire service. After moving back to California, he reported at the Salinas, California, the Contra Costa Times, and the Oakland Tribune before joining the Mercury News, and has been involved in crime and court coverage for more than 13 years. In 2017, he was part of a team of journalists with the Bay Area News Group. East Bay Times awarded the Pulitzer Prize in breaking news reporting for coverage of the Oakland Ghost Ship Fire. Welcome, Robert. And Captain Sean Washington. Captain Sean Washington was appointed commander of the Administrative Operations Division on January 19, 2020. He formerly served as commander of the Patrol Division from July 2017 to January 2020. Sean joined the Fremont Police Department in 1997 and worked several assignments, gaining experience as a detective, field training officer, SWAT team member, arrest control instructor, driving instructor, and member of the School Resource Officer Unit. He was promoted to the rank of sergeant in 2007, lieutenant in 2011, and captain in 2015 as the commander of the Special Operations Division. Sean earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from California State University, Hayward in 1997, and he is a Spartan, and he earned a master's degree in administration of justice from San Jose State University in 2007. He remains actively involved in Special Olympics Northern California and other community-based events. So, welcome, Sean, and everyone. We're really glad to have you on board, and you will hear from all of our wonderful speakers. But we'll start and we'll get right into the heart of this matter. And I would like to ask Stephen Solomon about why he created the Citizen's Guide to Recording the Police, and that is an NYU First Amendment Watch publication. And Professor Solomon is going to actually go through and talk to us about who has the right to record. Steve? Steve, can you unmute?
Okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So at First Amendment Watch, we saw the dramatic impact that smartphones were having in documenting police misconduct and how central this was in keeping public officials accountable. Everybody around the country is talking about this. And we saw how important it was for people to understand their rights, because also all around the country, people were being told not to take pictures, not to make videos. And sometimes that led to confrontations. If you go back to 1991, one can say that in a way was a starting point, because you may recall Rodney King was beaten up by Los Angeles police officers. And the reason we know that is because a man named George Holliday happened to see and record it. Now, you can see the video camera there, and I actually have one that I kind of dug out of a closet, which I can show you. This is about the size and weight, same vintage, just a different manufacturer. This is a Canon, he used a Sony, but you can see the size of this. It weighs several pounds, not so easy to take around with you. He saw what was happening from the balcony of his apartment, and he went back into his apartment and he retrieved the camera and started recording. Then he took the video cassette and took it to a TV station, and that started the whole discussion. And of course, there was a lot of violence in Los Angeles. But if we fast forward to 2020. There's more than 80% of the American people have cell phones, and you can't carry around one of these big cameras that I just showed you. Can't put it in your pocket, even hard to put in a backpack. But a cell phone, everybody's got it, and everybody can be a news gatherer. It doesn't matter whether you're a journalist. It doesn't have to be recording the police. We all know that people make recordings of all kinds of things. Everybody is a journalist these days in some regard. And so it's very important in fostering public knowledge of what's going on. The other important thing that George Holliday didn't have, but we have, is the fact that we can immediately upload this material to the web, to social media, to websites and so forth, and the world immediately knows what has just happened just moments ago. And so what this enables us to do is document what's going on in the streets. And the courts have said that the First Amendment protects this kinds of activity because the First Amendment was meant to protect the marketplace of ideas and enable people, citizens, to keep their government accountable. And so the making of, shooting and distribution of video material of what's going on in the streets serves both of these purposes, right? Because we see what's going on. We don't have to rely on accounts that are written up later, some of which may be subjective. We see what's going on, it's documented. Justice Brandeis said famously that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that's certainly true here. And it serves the marketplace of ideas because we can see every day the kind of discussion that goes on because of these videos. And so that's why the courts have protected the First Amendment right of people, journalists and bystanders, to make these videos wherever they are, subject to some limitations, which we'll talk about later. It's not an absolute right, but under normal circumstances to make videos and to be news gatherers, whether they're journalists or bystanders.
Thank you, Steve. So now there isn't, the public has the same right as journalists and vice versa, as Steve has just said. And I think in this current climate for news reporters, it's probably safe to say that it's important for all of us to be watchdogs, or be able to hold our institutions accountable, because in the current environment, there's a lot of hostility towards journalists, and we've seen this in various instances. If many of you think that the US is very high on the rankings of press freedoms, it's 45th out of the 2019-2020 rankings for Reporters Without Borders. It's 45th out of 179. So where there's a lot of hostility towards reporters, and Reporters Without Borders actually recorded and noted that there's been increased physical assaults, public denigration, and harassment of reporters in 2019. They work a year in advance. So looking at the current climate for news reporters, I'd like to bring in Robert Salonga, the criminal justice reporter for the Mercury News, and talk about this. And Robert, what has been your experience covering the protests over the summer? And you've been doing this for quite some time. And what changes have you seen in the environment for reporters, and especially covering criminal justice in courts?
Okay, Kimberly. So no, I appreciate you having me. I want to reemphasize that we're no different than the ordinary citizen as far as most of what our access rights are. So we're generally just like everybody else, and that's by design, because theoretically, under the Constitution, the reason it's in the Constitution is anybody should be able to be a journalist. There's no licensing for it or anything along those lines. But yeah, there has been increased hostility. There's a lot of what we've experienced, particularly in this last series of protests that started after the killing of George Floyd, is that we've noticed there has not been a lot of discerning between journalists and citizens and residents, as far as our access and ability, and particularly getting rounded up. That's been an issue across the country since it had been an issue before. We've had to make it clear and meet and often have conversations with police chiefs, make it clear that we show our credentials and identify ourselves as journalists, we're supposed to be left alone. for the most part, you know, absent us, you know, trespassing or violating some other rule or law. So that's been a concern. There have been much more high profile incidents of that across the country, of journalists, you know, seemingly being ignored when they assert their right to, you know, do their jobs. We had an incident in early June where one of our reporters was essentially rounded up, tackled for just kind of standing there by San Jose police, and we had to have, you know, those kinds of we had to have conversations with police administrators about that. We've had in San Francisco, we've had reporters who were, you know, rounded up and despite being identifying themselves as journalists, being let go only after they'd been detained for, you know, hours. So we're having to, you know, kind of have these conversations that, you know, we thought we didn't have to, you know, and to the second point of what you were bringing up, hostility toward journalists has definitely, you know, increased in the last 4 years. It's not a coincidence that, you know, the president's rhetoric in terms of identifying media and journalists as enemies of the people, and a lot of that has emboldened a lot of violence against journalists to the point where it used to be if you were a foreign correspondent, you know, that was kind of part of the deal. If you were going into you know, a war zone or something along those lines, that you might run into resistance or you know, some sort of you know, arrest situation. And now on the domestic side, we're having to, you know, kind of train our reporters to kind of deal with the potential for that, which is, again, not something we really had to think about often domestically, you know, before 2016.
Right, right. And Robert, we also had, I showed you a screenshot. There was the CNN reporter Omar Jimenez, who was actually arrested on camera while their cameras were rolling, and until the camera person was eventually arrested too. It just shows the change in climate for reporters. And as you mentioned, the Mercury News reporter who was brought down by police as well. Can you talk about some of your reporting, especially this one that's on screen? That's a more
Sure.
recent one.
Sure. So what we're seeing a lot more now, this has been proliferating for a while now over the last few years with the proliferation of smartphones and you know, especially the advent of HD video with phones. I mean, everyone's a camera person at this point, and so it's definitely shifted. You know, kind of the means of production, which I think in a good way, because it means there are a lot more eyes out there. Whereas before, you know, you'd have to see if there's a surveillance camera or something along those lines for something that we might be looking into. So to what you were saying earlier, the citizenry is definitely becoming news gatherers and newsmakers that, you know, given the state of the journalism industry, that we have to rely on more for eyewitness accounts. And it's kind of like having a super eyewitness at this point, because you're not just you know, relying on their memory, but you're relying on, you know, video footage that they've actually taken. And so you know, there's a lot to keep up with, because there's a lot of videos. There's a lot to kind of sort through, because not every you know, videotaped interaction or video record tape is antiquated, but every video recorded interaction is not always a story, and we have to be mindful of that in the pursuit of, you know, fairness in what we do. But it's definitely something that we all have had to adjust to, in terms of we have to scrutinize a lot of video. We're all video reviewers at this point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which leads me to my next question. Does the press pass or the press credentials even matter? Sophia Cope from EFF?
Well, I guess I would basically echo, and thank you for having me, by the way. I would basically echo what has already been said, in the sense that on the one hand, legally, it doesn't matter in the sense that the Supreme Court has not generally distinguished between the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. As Robert said, all Americans have the right to record the police. As a practical matter, one would hope that the press pass would matter, that they would be left alone, and actually maybe accommodated to where the police would allow reporters, especially reporters, to chronicle what's going on at a scene that's of high news gathering interest. But as everyone has said, like we have seen incidents where that's not the case, and the press is specifically targeted. But we've also seen incidents where bystanders, just average Americans, are recording the police, and they've also been retaliated against. So it's sort of a problem across the board.
And how has the Supreme Court defined, or has it defined, a news person?
Well, I mean, just to clarify, I mean, the real main context that is relevant to the definition of a news person or a reporter or a journalist is, if anyone who's taken media law knows, is the reporter's privilege to protect sources, and so that is unique to the press or to journalists, and in that context, the courts have typically defined a journalist or reporter not by the outlet they work for, like a newspaper or a TV station or whatnot, but I mean, some have, but it's typically a functional definition. Basically, a person who is gathering facts, information, with an intent to disseminate it to the public. And as I said, in the context of recording the police, there is absolutely zero distinction between the rights of the press and the rights of average Americans.
Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court hasn't decided on the right to record, but various jurisdictions have. Why is this significant? Steve and Sophia?
Well, I guess I can start off by saying that, yeah, so forgive me for being a little bit legalistic here, but yeah, the Supreme Court, of course, makes constitutional law for the entire country, but not all issues make their way to the Supreme Court. And so in the United States, we have 13 what are called federal circuits, which are these jurisdictions of federal appellate courts that make constitutional law that applies only within the states that are within those circuits. Now, the federal circuit is a circuit that doesn't really matter because it relates to intellectual property law, but there are 11 circuits plus the DC circuit, so 12 circuits for our purposes. And only 6 of those have expressly acknowledged the First Amendment right to record the police. But as Stephen said, and by all means, team, feel free to jump in. It's safe to say that in the circuits that have not expressly ruled on this issue, that there is enough First Amendment law related to the general right to gather information and to hold government accountable, that it's likely that those circuits will eventually uphold the right to record the police specifically.
Yeah, something like 60% of the American people live in the circuits that have recognized the First Amendment right. In the case of New York, you see on the map, New York is not covered there. It's in the Second Circuit. And, but there, over the summer, the New York legislature passed a law which gave the equivalent of First Amendment rights to people to make recordings. So that New York is protecting it in statutory law at the moment.
Now, there's a recent case that that you have talked about, Frazier versus Evans, and that's current. Let's talk about that and what that means to that circuit, and explaining it to people who don't have a legal background, and why these decisions in these circuits matter so much.
Yeah, so if you, I don't know if you want to show the map again. So the 10th Circuit is kind of in the covers the states kind of in the Mountain West. And the 10th Circuit has not expressly ruled on this issue, but it is, there is a case pending that's already been briefed, and it was argued earlier this year. EFF actually filed an amicus brief in this case. It's called Frazier versus Evans. And in terms of the constitutional rule, I'm very confident that the 10th Circuit will wholeheartedly adopt or endorse the First Amendment right to record the police in that circuit, because there was a similar, I should say, I guess somewhat similar case. It was related to an environmental, the environmental law context about recording on public and private lands to kind of, record environmental degradation or to, get soil samples or whatever. Anyways, in that case, the 10th Circuit actually looked at the police recording cases and very much spoke highly of those cases. So it, like I said, it seems very likely that the 10th Circuit will endorse that right. But the facts of this case, I think, are really interesting. We've blogged about it. Clearly, Reporters Committee has as well. You could just Google it.
Can you share some of the basics, because I think people would be able to really understand.
Yeah. So essentially, what happened? Well, what I was going to say is that it's interesting because it shows both the value of recording and also the risk to the recorder. So Mr. Frazier, he was the plaintiff because he ended up suing the Denver Police Department for violating his First Amendment right to record. And Mr. Frazier was just driving along in downtown Denver somewhere on his way to work, and he saw a bunch of Denver police surrounding a man in a parking lot, and he saw a police officer in particular, just pummeling this guy in the mouth, and the guy's head was, according to Mr. Frazier and ultimately the video, was just bouncing off of the pavement. And then he also saw, well, actually, let me back up. He saw there was an altercation and it looked like it was getting violent. So he pulled to the side, and then he took out his tablet and he started recording. And what the recording showed is that the police were pummeling this guy's head against the pavement, and they tripped his pregnant girlfriend because she was hysterical. She was telling them to stop hitting him. And another officer just basically like swept her legs and tripped her. And Mr. Frazier was just so disgusted by what he saw that, he kept recording. And one of the police officers noticed that he was recording, and the police officer very, very aggressively came over and just sort of started harassing him and told him to stop recording, and ultimately took the tablet out of his hand, somehow figured out how to delete the recording. And I think they even detained him for a while. And later, apparently, the tablet was on this sort of perpetual cloud backup. And so Mr. Frazier was able to retrieve the video, and he sent it to a local TV station. And what precipitated from that is that the Colorado legislature, as Steve was mentioning in New York, had passed a law expressly protecting the right as a statutory matter to record the police. And the Denver police also changed their written policies, which I know we'll get to shortly. So, but Mr. Frazier was just so upset. He was like, this can't happen again. And he felt like there needed to be a constitutional ruling. And so that's why he brought a case as a plaintiff, hoping to get the 10th Circuit to say that as a matter of constitutional law, citizens have a right to record the police. So that way there would both be a constitutional right and a statutory right, and a policy adopted by the Denver police.
So where everyone's still watching this case.
Yeah, like I said, it was briefed and it was argued earlier this year, and so we're just waiting for the decision to come out, frankly, any day now. So.
But the thing is, the right to record has its limitations. What are reasonable time, place, and manner limitations on the right to record? Steve?
So the First Amendment right to record is not absolute. there are limitations. They're called in law time, place, and manner restrictions. So a police officer can't legally come up to a person and say, you can't record because I don't want you to record. That's not a sufficient reason. What they can do in certain circumstances is maybe move somebody away from the situation if it's a matter of public safety, or streets are being blocked, if there's an arrest being made and the person is too close to the police officer such that they may be impeding what the police officers are doing, then the police officers have every right to ask the person to move, not to stop them from recording, but to move them to a place where the police can do their job and the person can safely record. There are situations where, let's say there's an active shooter. Maybe under those circumstances, the police could say, you know, you can't be here at all for your own safety. So these are reasonable limitations that the police can use to control the scene of an accident, the scene of an arrest. There's a case actually in the 1970s that gives a pretty good example of what we're talking about. This is, of course, before cell phones and even video cameras, but there was a car that was driving down the Garden State Parkway in New Jersey, and it went off the road, went down an embankment, and the driver unfortunately died in the accident, and her daughter sitting next to her was pinned inside the car. The car was overturned, gasoline was dripping down to the ground, and there was one police officer there. There were about 50 people who had stopped and were gathered around, and a newspaper photographer came along to take photographs. That's what photographers do for newspapers. But he got right up to the car, and the police officer asked him to move, that he was impeding the rescue and endangering the security and safety of the young woman in the car, and he refused to move. They had a back and forth, and the photographer said, I won't move, I need to be up this close to take good photos. And so the result was he was arrested for disorderly conduct. The case went all the way up to the New Jersey Supreme Court, which ruled that the police officer was acting reasonably under the situation. And had the reporter moved, who knows, 15 feet away, 20 feet away, that would have been fine. And there would have been no problem, no arrest, and he could have gotten photographs, maybe not exactly the photographs that he wanted, but certainly things that he could use to inform the public. So those are some examples of the reasonable limitations that police can impose on people who are making, taking photographs or making videos. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So going off of that and talking about what police officers are told and how they are trained, I'd like to turn to Captain Sean Washington of the Fremont Police. And Sean, we've talked about how things have changed over time, and what things were like 10 years ago is different from what they are now. What's in the Fremont Police Department handbook, and talk to us about how time has changed and policies have changed.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you for allowing me to be here. Like Stephen just summed up so well, those are some of the limitations with allowing our community members to record the police. It has very specific limitations. And so we try to construct our policy to align with that and train our officers on when it would be appropriate and when it's not appropriate to try to restrict or limit someone from recording. So we start with the understanding that everyone's allowed to record. And then only in those specific situations where someone's life might be in danger or there's an interference with lawful and legal police actions, those type of things is when we will try to, through cooperation first, make some adjustments. And then as a last resort, we may have to take some lawful action against an individual. But I will say, like, this particular topic, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, I think someone mentioned Rodney King. I lived in LA at the time during that time. And, you know, we've made advances even 10 years after Rodney King, right? And you know, the early 2000s, that's when you started to see cell phones. And so everyone out there has a cell phone with the ability to record, and that's okay. That really is okay from my perspective. We actually embrace that, or we should embrace it as an entire profession. I know in certain areas throughout the country, maybe that doesn't always consistently happen, but at least in this region, in the city of Fremont, we actually encourage our community members to have more cameras. We have a community camera project where we ask them to go out and purchase more cameras in the neighborhood so we can record what's going on, whether that's a car stop, whether that's a criminal act or whatever. We encourage that because we think it's a cooperative process. Accountability is key, absolutely. It doesn't offend me, nor should it offend law enforcement that our community wants to hold their government accountable via the use of video recordings. Multiple recordings are a good thing, different perspectives. We can make the assumption that everything's being recorded all the time. I typically make that assumption. When I go to the store, I know I'm on someone's camera somewhere. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. It works. It has benefits for both the government and the community. One prime example for our police department was June 1st, 2016. You might remember that we had 2 officers shot by a suspect in our city. And the officer was solo. He was by himself. He was shot in the head. And if not for a community member having their cell phone and capturing that attempted murder on that officer, we may not have known which way the suspect ran, the clothing description, understood fully what happened to the officer. So it was in the best interest of the public for that community member to have that video camera and share that footage with law enforcement. Now, the footage on a camera, we're talking about privacy rights, it does belong to the individual. So we as the government should not demand that footage or demand access to that. We can get consent, obviously, unless we feel like it's in the best interest of public safety. Someone's going to die right now. Someone may say they're going to, you know, do some sort of violent act or something like that. And even in those cases, we should seek a warrant to access that information. So yeah, we try to educate our officers on what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate, understanding that this is embedded in the First Amendment. It pains me to hear some of the experiences that some of the folks on the calls have had with law enforcement, but I think as a whole, we've come a long way with understanding that we should embrace this and not run from it. So anyway, that's my perspective. I see you have our policy up, and that kind of explains some of the things that some of your panel members have.
Can you share one of your experiences where you've been in an incident or doing an arrest and people have been recording, where sometimes these lines of the policy aren't always clear, being so close to the activity, interfering, those are not always very clear on either side what that means, and it has to be decided on a case-by-case basis.
It really is a case-by-case basis. You know, it depends on the situation. It depends on if we can articulate some sort of public harm or safety issue that's being presented. Interference, you know, with an arrest, maybe encouraging someone that's being arrested to resist, those type of things. All of those things have been present. I've been on scene where people have recorded. I don't think anything of it. I got to be honest. I really don't, because I have my video camera on. They have their video camera on. And in fact, I'd like to get their angle, their perspective, so that we can piece it all together, right? So we all know that cameras only have one angle, one perspective. And so getting all the perspectives, I think is in the best interest of our community as a whole. So yeah, there has been situations where, you know, I've been recorded, but never have I been on scene or been involved in a situation where we tried to restrict that. We have tried to push back the crowd or suggest another location so that they can get their shot, but I can't think of a situation where we have tried to restrict that behavior.
Another thing, Sean, when we're talking about is, does it matter who's recording, who's doing the recording? We have some of the extreme cases, such as the gentleman Ramsey Orta who recorded Eric Gardner, the incident there, and it is reportedly he was retaliated against. And so he is a person of color, and he's the one doing the recording. And reportedly, he was retaliated against by NYPD, went to jail a year after, went to prison a year after for different kinds of claims. But this kind of retaliation does occur. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the retaliation portion of that particular incident, so I can't really speak on that because I don't have a lot of the facts behind that. But a short answer to your question is absolutely not. It does not matter who's recording. Their actions and their behavior is what matters, right? But I should say that with a little bit of caution that if someone from the media identified themselves, that does change a little bit because, as you know, there are certain access that we can allow media that we may not necessarily allow to the general public. You know, we can't disrupt the crime scene, a disaster area, those type of things. We can keep the general public out, but the media has access to that. And so as long as we point out the hazards and try to direct them to a safe location, in that sense, it matters a little bit. You know, if you're a member of the media, you may have a little bit more access, but the fundamental act of recording in public, it doesn't matter. Everybody has that right, and we can do it all day long.
Robert, does it matter who's recording, considering the Ramsey Orta or Steve or Sophia? In writing and policy, we all have the same right, but in practice, who we are and you know, what color we are in recording can actually create a different kind of atmosphere. Any thoughts on that?
So yeah, I think fundamentally that's correct. I mean, there's no difference between, you know, someone like me who's out there, even if I have a press pass and, you know, a quote unquote ordinary citizen. I think that there, like to what the captain was referencing, you know, there are certain concessions that are made because of the traditional relationship that media has had as a proxy for the people. So if you can't let, you know, there's a reason why, you know, there can be the media news conferences, that sort of thing can be restricted, especially in the era of COVID, expressly because you can't have a bunch of people at the same spot, even if they have, you know, a presumptive right to a spot, you know, for things like that. This is a, you know, I was out covering the Santa Cruz Mountains fires over the past couple of weeks, and, you know, we have a special, we have access. I mean, we also are clearing authorities of liability for what happens to us when we go into a fire zone, you know, and pass the barricade. But that's born out of the idea that we're effectively a proxy for the public, because you can't just let everybody through into a fire zone to see what's going on. But pick up your trash. Yeah. But fundamentally, you know, other than those kinds of those types of accommodations, you know, we're not supposed to be any different with respect to access. And just to reference something that was said before, as far as you know, the effectiveness of a press pass, I'll tell you right now, a press pass is as good as the authority figure who's in front of you, who's willing to honor it. That there's this is something again we ran into with the fires. You know, there were some uninformed CHP officers who were keeping us out of zones that we had access to. And what I can't do is just say, hey, I know what my rights are. I'm just going to drive past you. No, I'm going to get arrested for doing that. It's not, this is not, being and getting the different things. And so I just want to make that clear to especially the journalism students out there, that a press pass is a means of verifying that you are what you are, but it's not a magic or golden ticket to get to places, even if you have the presumptive right to be there.
Steve, Sophia, anything on that? I guess what I'm trying to get to is, I'll give the example, I brought it up earlier about Omar Jimenez covering the protests in the summer in the same place. So we have a recognized news outlet, someone with the press pass, and a crew with them. Josh Campbell was just, I think, a couple miles away, and Omar Jimenez is arrested on camera. And so what I'm trying to get at is, does it matter who's behind the camera and what color they are and what they represent? Is there, and as Robert is saying, it also matters who's in front of them, who is the law enforcement official in front of them, and how are their identities read, and how is that applied in that moment? And I draw the, there were pretty much a very close scene. One reporter of color is arrested, the other is not. Sure, yes, maybe the minor details are different, but I'm looking at whether it's the public, whether it was Frazier or Orta, or whether it's Jimenez or Campbell. Doesn't matter who's doing the reporting. What do these incidents say about the sensitivities of who's doing the reporting?
I think those are broader issues, though, that aren't very specific, that probably aren't specific to journalists. I mean, I have different experiences reporting than white colleagues. That's just a matter of fact. I mean, it works in a couple of ways. There are environments in which I can't move around, kind of uninterrupted, and then there are other environments where I can, because I look like the people there. So that does move both ways. But as far as the idea of kind of police making that discernment, I mean, that would be reflective of culture, in terms of geography, of a lot of different factors. Because especially in a situation like what was going on in Minnesota, you had a lot of media coming in from a lot of different places, and sometimes if you want to be charitable about it, sometimes it's a matter of familiarity, and maybe it's not. But that, I think that's reflective of like broader issues that we're all grappling with now, that aren't always specific to whether you're a reporter or not.
And I guess what I would add is that not every police department is as sort of sophisticated on this as Fremont, for example, or as Captain Washington. And so, the Frazier case shows you, I mean, Frazier is a white guy, and he was completely harassed, and, they grabbed his device and they tried to delete the video, which, by the way, I want to underscore what Captain Washington said, that it actually is a Fourth Amendment violation to take your electronic device and search it without a warrant. So keep that in mind as well. There was a really important Supreme Court case in 2014 called Riley versus California, which underscored that. But yeah, so what I would just say is that while clearly there might be racial undertones in some of these circumstances, there are police officers who just don't like being recorded irrespective of the race of the recorder. And so I frankly would just keep that in mind, that there are officers individually and police departments more broadly that, like I said, are maybe not as sophisticated as Fremont, for example, may not have a policy in place, may not have done training on this issue. So I would just keep in mind in general that there might be hostility toward recording irrespective of what you look like or if you have a press pass or not.
Yeah, I'm collecting policies of different Bay Area police departments on recording, and if they have a policy in their handbooks, and they're training police officers. And there's a variety of ways that these are expressed in handbooks. And I think Fremont has probably a little bit more of an extensive one, and seems to have a good outlook on it, as Sean says. How about wiretapping and eavesdropping laws? And this is also something that's talked about. Can news gatherers sometimes violate those laws when exercising their First Amendment right to record, especially wiretapping laws? Sophia and Steve?
Yeah, so I can jump in. So far we've been talking about the constitutional right, the First Amendment right to record the police, but there are, as Lehman was saying, there are statutes on the books that are called wiretapping laws or statutes or eavesdropping statutes. And they're quirky because they only apply to audio recording. So as a general matter, recording the police, I mean, that can include photographs, that can include video without audio, that can include video and audio together, which is typically what people do. If you turn on your iPhone, for example, and you turn your camera to video, it's going to automatically record video and audio at the same time, or it can just be audio. And so, like I said, the wiretap statutes only implicate audio recording, whether or not it's coupled with video as well. And so there have been cases that have come down and interpreted the wiretap statutes in light of the First Amendment right to record the police, so sort of trying to reconcile them with the First Amendment. And what's important to know is that the short answer is that generally, no, you're not going to get in trouble for violating the wiretap statute, which are criminal statutes. They typically have two main elements. One is a consent element. So some states require only one party to the conversation to consent to the recording. Other states require all parties to consent. California actually is an all-party consent state. And then the other element of these statutes is that, typically speaking, private conversations cannot be recorded without consent. So only private conversations are protected. And so when we're talking about the right to record the police, or just the context of recording the police with audio, if you're looking at the first element regarding consent, if you are the person who's interacting with the police, so for example, if you are the one who's being arrested, or you've been pulled over, or you whatever in some kind of interaction with a police officer on the street or the sidewalk, you are in a one-party consent wiretap statute state. You are the one party consenting to the recording, and so you don't have to get the police officer's consent. If you are in an all-party consent state, and you happen to be a bystander, so you want to record a police officer interacting with other people or doing something else where you're not a part of that situation, if you hold your phone up, for example, out in the open, and it's clear that you are recording, and sometimes the consent of the officer can be implied, and the other people, frankly, as well, if they don't object. Now, if the officer says, "I object to you recording," then that can get a little bit tricky, at least on that element. So those are sort of the two typical situations of related to the consent element of these statutes. But more importantly, on the element of whether or not the conversation is private, and I put that in quotation, the courts that have looked at this have said unequivocally that police officers exercising their official duties in public, so they're on duty, they're sort of out in the public, not in a private space, they're doing something consistent with their jobs, like an arrest or a questioning or helping somebody in an accident or something like that, that in those contexts, police officers do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And so there is just no violation of the wiretap statute, because that so-called conversation that the police officer is involved in is not considered private. So yeah, it's something that police, there was a First Circuit case, for example, like that came out of Boston, where the recorder, some man was recording Boston police arresting someone else, and the Boston police arrested him for violating the wiretap statute because they were upset that he was recording them. And the First Circuit unequivocally said this was not a violation of the wiretap statute because cops don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy.
Well, that follows what Sean was saying earlier too, that he expects that he's being recorded all the time, right?
Yeah.
I'd like to add, in a more general way, of course, any state statute is subject to review under the First Amendment. And when you read these decisions from these various federal circuit courts, you really understand very quickly that these courts are focusing on the values behind the First Amendment and the public interest that the First Amendment serves in fostering public discussion and holding government officials accountable. And they're not real eager in cases like this to uphold state laws where it unreasonably restricts reporters and bystanders from making the kinds of recordings that in fact hold officers accountable. So it's not that every statute would automatically be struck down, but in a sense, it's not a fair fight between some of these statutes and the Constitution of the United States when the courts are so strongly valuing the public debate and discussion and the holding of public officials to accountability.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have some questions coming in the chat. And so one question from Helene Braun is, how do you distinguish between a private conversation and a non-private conversation? Is there a clear distinction? Who wants to take that question?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at that. So I guess what I want to emphasize is that when you're talking about, like I said, recording the police exercising their official duties in public, or just exercising their official duties in general, because maybe they've come to your house for some reason because you called 911 and it's not in a public place per se, but they're on duty and you want to record them. Like I said, the courts have basically said that the police officers don't have an expectation of privacy in that context. So that's really what I think the key takeaway is. Now, if the question relates to how do wiretap statutes apply to news gathering in general, that is a much broader question. But I think, if you look at the case law, it's pretty reasonable. I mean, sort of if people are speaking in a whisper, if they have their backs turned, if they're, trying to go off in the corner, where clearly they're trying to maintain some semblance of privacy. I think all of those facts would be really important if the case was before the court. Now, of course, not all scenarios go in front of a judge, but this question really is a fact intensive question, but basically it goes to like these indicia of whether or not the people involved in the conversation are showing signs that they want to keep it private. These wiretap statutes actually apply to phone calls too. So if you just call somebody as a reporter and you're in an all-party consent state, it's pretty much assumed that a conversation between two people, that's supposed to be a private conversation unless there's an express discussion about, this is being recorded or whatever. And so, when reporters call me, they say, can I record this conversation? And I say, yes. And that's like the right thing to do. So, if you're being an investigative reporter and you're in an all-party consent state, then you need to talk to your newsroom counsel about that. But yeah, as far as recording the police, it's safe to say that, if they're on duty and you want to record them, while they're on duty and doing a thing that is related to their job, then the statutes don't apply in those contexts.
Yeah, but they apply when you're having a conversation with the police officer on the phone. You still need to let them know that you're recording.
To be safe, yeah.
Another question here, are all police departments around the United States being told they have to expect being recorded no matter where you are? Sean, do you have knowledge of other Bay Area or other national police departments and what they're being told?
It's really depends on what region you're in. There is no blanket, policy on this across the United States that I'm aware of. But I think to my point earlier, where we are just with the technology, I think it's safe to assume most police departments or all police departments should assume that you are being recorded. So I can't speak for the other police agencies throughout the country, but at least in the Bay Area with all the technology and specific to my organization, it's well understood that all your actions are being recorded. In fact, we're going to hang a recorder on your body and require you to activate that recorder, because we do expect that we capture our actions and can be accountable for them. So, I can't speak to, nationally if all police departments are kind of have this approach, but I'm just making a professional assumption that I think most police departments should be smart enough to figure out that, there's cameras everywhere and they're on camera and they're being recorded. And again, that's not a bad thing, just not.
Well, there's certainly a lot of incentive for training, because a lot of police departments are getting sued. There's settlements that involve a lot of money. So there's all kinds of reasons for the police to get the proper training.
Well, and I would like to add that that's a great point, that along with the incentive to, that you just spoke about, what we found is that not only is it important for the community to hold the police accountable, but also a lot of times what we do with these recordings is it validates or justifies the police officer's actions. So prior to getting body cameras and everyone having a cell phone, there were a lot of unfounded accusations lobbed at the police that now can be proven to be false. So it kind of works both ways. We're holding, the community is held accountable to reporting an accurate a report of what happened and just not embellish or inflate the facts. So that we found that our officers embrace that, because when they're being accused of excessive force or inappropriate behavior, and we played the video from multiple angles and that never occurred, that's a good thing. Again, that's accountability 360 degrees, right? And so that's why we embrace it.
Thank you for that. We have another question that explains the scenario. It says, I had an interaction with the San Jose Police Department officer who does extra hours to protect the store I work at downtown. This police officer made me deeply uncomfortable, telling me Trump 2020 and harassed me for about an hour about politics. He removed his mask and spit on me when he was talking to me. I have been really unsure about how to handle him without putting my safety at risk. How do you handle issues with officers that are behaving inappropriately like this? Could I record a one-on-one conversation with the police officer on private property?
If I can just speak to the first, I'll speak to the first part, and maybe our legal minds can follow up with that second part, which I think we probably covered earlier. But every police department has a complaint process. And so it is your option whether or not you want to remain anonymous or you want to reveal who you are. So if you feel like the officer, we're talking about accountability, if you feel like the officer was inappropriate, made some inappropriate comments, every police department has a complaint process. And here's again where if something was recorded, and I'm not saying recorded in an illegal way, but maybe there was a store camera there or some other thing that captured this interaction, that would be helpful. So I would encourage you, if you're fearful of being retaliated against or something like that, you can definitely contact that particular jurisdiction and report your experience, and hopefully it'll work out.
And I can add to that, you know, given that this is specifically happening in San Jose, you know, if there is a concern about, you know, the idea of reporting police misconduct to a police department, San Jose does have an Office of the Independent Police Auditor, which is an alternative repository to lodge police complaints. It's a civilian office. They are independent from, you know, they operate independently, largely independently of other city agencies. It's not a real-time solution because it's not going to get, it may not get that behavior fixed, you know, right away, but it is an avenue. It's a civilian avenue. They are a city appointed watchdog. And so that's easy to find. You can look up Office of the Independent Police Auditor, San Jose, super easy to find on the internet. And I think that might be one way to lodge that. If, again, speaking to what the captain just said, if you have some concerns or fears about, you know, the idea of reporting police misconduct to a police department, you can do that. You can do that as well, in addition to the avenue that the captain just explained, which also exists in San Jose. But as far as immediate relief, you know, it starts a process.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, and there was another question by Lauren Leffer about accountability, and I think that answers that question as well. There's a question, is it appropriate to ask officers for name and badge number if they do threatening gestures, comments, or behaviors such as the one Jared Yuen acted against peaceful protesters? So this was a San Jose police officer. Robert, you reported on that. There's some reporting in your stories about that police officer. But the first question is it appropriate to ask officers for name and badge number?
Well, from my perspective, the law requires that we have a name or a badge number affixed to us when we're in uniform. So one or the other will be, you should be able to have that visibly shown on the officer. But again, it's one of these things where because we have to advertise our number or our name, why would that be offensive for me to say, yes, my badge number is 2831 and I'm Captain Sean Washington of the Fremont Police Department? It shouldn't be, right? I'm not saying that some officers don't take offense to that, but sure, it's appropriate. It's not inappropriate to ask for an officer's name and badge number because they should have one or the other on their uniform to begin with.
And so there's a follow-up to that. What do you do if the officer hides or refuses to tell you their badge number or name? Some hide their badge numbers with their hands or hide them.
Well, again, to what Robert stated, if I just described that the law clearly states you have to have one or the other visible, unless you're in plain clothes and those type of things. But then there's a mechanisms in place to follow up on that with that particular jurisdiction. So I would just offer that as an avenue to resolve that particular situation.
And I would add, take a picture if you can. If you see that, well, I've seen that, you know, covering, you know, unrest and protests in Oakland. You'll sometimes see, especially when mutual aid is called in, and so an outside police agency is providing assistance to the home police agency of a city. You'll sometimes see a badge number covered in like electrical tape or something along those lines, and that's not allowed. And you know, but your recourse in the moment is very limited, you know, because if they say they don't want to tell you, you have no means to compel them to tell you what their badge number or name is. But you know, along the lines of what the whole point of what we've been talking about, take a picture, take a video, like that may be useful in some, you know, internal investigation, or again, bring it to the IPA. At some point, it'll come to the attention of you know, an internal affairs investigator or someone along those lines who can, you know, work around the fact that that badge number is covered up, because that's definitely a violation of policy.
Yeah, and there were incidents in, I think, Portland also, where there were federal agents, law enforcement agents that were not marked, that were just in black clothing. So that does happen. There's a question here. It says, does the fact that the police are so, from Barbie, so aware of being recorded, doesn't that incite more retaliation towards media or persons videotaping? Also, I guess to Sean too, that because you're assuming that you're always being recorded, um, or have that expectation, does that change the way you behave, or what you assume of people around you during an incident?
Well, I'd like to believe that it it ensures that our officers are always considering their professionalism, that their actions need to meet the standard of public expectation and what's proper in law enforcement. So we all, I mean, we all behave differently when we know that we are being recorded and it can be played back later. But I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing in law enforcement at all. So if it's maybe, you know, not using profanity, or, you know, just being a little bit more professional, that's good. So making the assumption that you're always on video, I don't see that as being a bad thing, or that creates any hostility towards the media or anything like that, because you know, we should be held accountable for our behaviors. We police with the consent of the community. That's, the community are the police and the police are the community. And so we have to rise to that standard that's been set. And what are the expectations of the community? That we police in a fair, unbiased, and reasonable way. And so anyway, that would be my response to that. I just see it as being a positive, not a negative.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sophia.
What I was gonna say is that it is true that open recording can inspire retaliation, as we saw in the Frazier case. And so I just wanted to underscore that the vast majority of wiretap statutes, specifically if we're looking at those, like I said, they only protect private conversations, and so the consent part is a little bit less relevant, right? So if police, like I said, police officers out in public don't have an expectation of privacy, so you can more discreetly record them, both with audio and video. Now, the one, I'm not expert on all 50 wiretap statutes, but I do know that Massachusetts is a little quirky in the sense that it protects conversations without consent, recording of conversations without consent, regardless of whether those conversations are private or not. And so the ACLU of Massachusetts actually has a pending case challenging, under the First Amendment, the Massachusetts wiretap statute, to the extent that it would prohibit the secret audio recording of police officers, because again, on the face of the statute, public and private conversations are both protected from secret recording. And so the ACLU is saying, well, look, citizens need to be able to discreetly or secretly record the police to avoid retaliation, and that the statute is unconstitutional to the extent that it protects police officers out in public, and where those so-called conversations or interactions are not private, there is no expectation of privacy. So that is sort of a quirky wiretap statute that is being constitutionally challenged. But in general, I would say that you should be able to discreetly record if you are concerned, about potential retaliation.
Just along those lines, just for analysis purposes, or something to think about for all of the journalism students that are out there. The thing. There is everyone should have a presumption that they're being recorded, which means that, say for instance, in the article that was referenced at the start of this session that I wrote about with respect to an officer being recorded, appearing to kick and drag a person who wasn't resisting. All those people knew they were being recorded. Everyone knew they were being recorded. The officers involved in the George Floyd incident, knew they were being recorded. So it's created this new baseline to kind of view upon these things, because if they know they're being recorded and they do these things anyway, that's something to look into in terms of they're either acting emboldened as if they don't care, or they feel a sense of impunity, whether it's legal or otherwise. And those are things we all need to kind of look at as journalists. Because there's this big push for body cameras over the last decade. It happened for the most part. We're still seeing this stuff, right? And so it's like, and again, it's a lot of it is a matter of scale. Because obviously there are a lot of police interactions that don't lead to something that goes viral. So that's something to consider as well. But it's something we all have to think about insofar that everything's on camera. This is still happening. That's something something to both look into and be concerned about.
With that point, and that's a great point, but can we infer that prior to cell phones and prior to body cameras, to your point that these things are still happening, and they are, unfortunately, maybe they were happening more often, because there was not this extra layer of accountability that's in place now. So even though the cameras are rolling and these things are still happening, at least now the public can view these things, or they can view it more often, to where now we can start holding some of these criminals wearing a badge accountable for their actions, versus 20, 30, 40 years ago, where maybe this was even more commonplace. I guess that's my point, is that I think it has added some professionalism to law enforcement because of cell phones, media, and body cams. I guess that's my point.
I think maybe we're talking also a little bit about qualified immunity for police officers. That I think, Robert, maybe you're trying to get to that even though there are body cameras and even though there's more citizen footage or journalist footage, that it still is not holding up in court and under qualified immunity for police officers.
I'll leave it to the legal folks to talk about qualified immunity, but I think I just wanted to cap and respond to what the captain was saying. With respect to, I think I agree that this could be a deterrent. But what the point I was making is that when we see a situation that happens in spite of the fact that there are body cameras and cell phone cameras and surveillance cameras, it makes those incidents now they can be considered more egregious, because they know all of those lenses around them were still not a deterrent for these incidents. So I think that's what it's created like this new baseline just to speak to what you're saying, because if we're still so what I'm saying is the incidents that we're seeing now post camera, if the ones that do happen are now more egregious, because again, like you said, everyone should know they're being recorded.
Fair point. Very good point.
So when someone is retaliated against and they sue a police officer or the police department, it's generally the case that the police officer might be disciplined because the police officer did something wrong, but the court is not going to impose money damages on the police officer because they generally rule, at least up to now, that the right to record police has not been well enough established up to now. And that's been a pretty consistent stance taken by the courts. But as time goes on, and there's more and more court rulings, police get better trained, then I think you're going to see more individual accountability in terms of having to pay money out of their own pockets for infringing on an individual's rights. We're not quite there yet. We don't have those rulings, but we might look at that as another layer of accountability for the future.
There's another question here. It says, a question in regards to recording in 2 or all party consent states. If the officer is performing duties in public, does the officer's right to say, quote, "I object to being recorded," end quote, trump the reasonable expectation that police can be recorded in public? That's part of the question, then I'll get to the other side. So if they say, "I don't want to be recorded."
Yeah, so this is what I was getting at before, is that when you think of a statute and a criminal statute and whether or not you violated it, there are different elements that all have to have supporting facts. And so one of the elements is the consent element. And so you're absolutely right. If you're in an all-party consent state and the cop expressly says, I do not consent to you recording, well, you've just lost on that element. But if the cop is out in public performing their official duties, on duty, doing a thing that is consistent with their job, and you want to record that, well, that goes to the second element of whether or not they have a reasonable expectation of privacy. That is, the statute, the wiretap statute prohibits audio recording of private conversations, again, except for in Massachusetts. And so you will win on that second element. And if, as any criminal defense lawyer knows, all you have to do is to win on one element, even if the prosecution has proven that all the rest of the elements. So you just have to knock out one to ultimately not to show that you've not violated the statute.
Okay, and then in that part of that same question, it says, conversely, if you are recording an incident in public of someone, for example, being detained or arrested, how do you determine consent or get consent for the detainee or the person being recorded?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And this is something that we have struggle is probably too strong of a word, but we've thought about it at EFF because we're a free speech organization, but we're also a privacy organization. But I guess I would say when you're talking about as a bystander wanting to record a police officer's interaction with another member of the public, the question is whether or not that interaction or that conversation between the police officer and like the person they're arresting, for example, again, is that a private scenario? And one could argue that an arrestee might not want to be recorded. There might be some semblance of a privacy interest in that for the arrestee, but the courts have generally said that, again, like, this is happening out in public, that the focus is on the police officer and the accountability, as we've been talking about, of the police officer. And so, again, while there might be some privacy interests that the civilian has, really the focus is on the police officer. And like I said, ensuring accountability there, and that just the other indicia of privacy of a private interaction just aren't really there if it's, like I said, sort of out in public, like the officer arresting someone on the sidewalk or something like that. But again, people who have had a media law class and have focused on news gathering, there are cases that where reporters have actually been sued for violating people's privacy, even out in public, sort of in kind of intense accident scenes, and where people are getting treated by EMS and things like that. And that has nothing to do with the police, but the idea is that those victims, in some cases, have won privacy invasion lawsuits against reporters. So privacy in public is not is still it's a possibility, but when you're talking about police officers and the focus is on the police officers, that for the privacy interests of the average citizen, those are a little less relevant.
Thank you for that, Sophia. And there's probably going to be what's going to be our last question for today. I would like some specific information about what accountability actually means in this context. Where is the supporting data that recording police actually results in personal legal consequences for involved officers?
Well, I can jump in. I don't want to hog the microphone here. We actually EFF has filed, I think at this point, 4 amicus briefs, a friend of the court briefs, in cases related to recording the police. And there's one that we did most recently where we really tried to focus, and I'm blanking on the case right now, but I could definitely dig it up, where we really tried to focus in our brief about accountability. So we didn't just say, here's a video on YouTube that shows, the cops behaving badly, but we really tried to dig, and it really just was just sort of fact research, on Google and news articles and stuff, really tried to dig in and figure out, well, what were the consequences and a handful of these incidents that we highlighted in our brief. And so while it's definitely true that unfortunately a lot of police officers don't get disciplined, there are really great examples where if it hadn't been for the bystander civilian recording, there wouldn't have been accountability, right? So we see officers getting frankly fired from their departments. We see policies being changed, like I said, in the Frazier case in the 10th Circuit. I mean, the Denver, I keep saying Denver, the Colorado legislature actually revamped their state statutes related to this. The Denver police revamped its policy. So there are examples of good things coming out of these recordings, but we have to be honest with the fact that these recordings happen and there doesn't seem to be any accountability in some instances, which is unfortunate. But I'm a big believer in the value of police recordings to not only hold police accountable, but as Captain Washington was saying, to actually just show what happened. And maybe sometimes we can get a really good story about a cop doing something really good. And I think that's good for our society as well.
And just to piggyback on that, I think we're really just scratching the surface on, I know the question mentioned data, and we're about a year and a half into a new police transparency records law, SB 1421, where we've been now the public now has the right to access disciplinary records for discipline or just general police records in four specific categories, where it's it's a police shooting or a significant use of force, an instance where discipline was handed out for dishonesty, for sexual assault on duty. We're just scratching the surface and trying to find out through those records over the years, how much discipline, how discipline has been getting handed out, and what was the catalyst for that. Was it a recording, that sort of thing? The different departments are showing different levels of compliance over the past year and a half with releasing those records. Some have been very good. Some have, were shredding documents on December 31st, 2018. And so we're as of right now, the Mercury News is in the middle of a lawsuit with the city of San Jose to get those records expedited and provided in accordance with the law. So we're hoping that we're going to see more of that data out there, and it's a laborious process, but there are efforts to also expand SB 1421 to include instance of racism, like provable racism, that sort of thing. So we're really just getting started. So much of these records were sealed and protected under state law, and we're only starting to kind of shine the light on what essentially has been a cave of disciplinary records going back decades.
Right, that's an important point.
It's not just the recording itself, but the conversation and the public pressure that's brought on officials to take action. You see, it seems like over the last year or two that prosecutors have been reacting more, faster in their investigations. Policemen have been suspended. Cases have been brought. There's been a history of juries not seeing it the prosecutor's way for a variety of reasons. But the public pressure these days with the demonstrations and public conversation, I think, has ratcheted up the pressure on public officials to take action. Again, going back to sovereign immunity, there's still no responsibility on the officer's part to pay any money damages in civil actions against them. But in the criminal sphere and in terms of keeping their jobs, maybe we're onto another sphere right now because of all the things that have been going on the last couple of years.
And just one more tangible impact as far as recordings go. We're seeing an increasing number of district attorneys' offices throughout the state that are now making a policy to review body camera before they determine whether to file what's known as a standalone 148. It's resisting arrest in the absence of other crimes, because it's been shown to be a tool that or a point of arrest that affects people of color more in a very skewed way. So just to kind of answer that idea of what have the results been, you're seeing prosecutors adopting policies now where they're going to review the body camera before they even consider filing a standalone resisting arrest charge, because that's often used as a someone off and that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We've hit 2:30, and this was a fantastic conversation. I think we've touched on a lot of the issues that are important. I know there's a lot more to say, and there's a lot more that's going to roll out around this issue. But thank you, Sean Washington, Captain Washington. Thank you, Robert Salonga, especially in the middle of a reporting day. So thank you, Robert, for taking that time. Thank you, Stephen Solomon, Professor Solomon, and Cynthia Cope from the EFF. I hope everyone's enjoyed the discussion, and we're able to take away some important points. And just stay tuned. We're going to probably have more conversations like this in the coming months about different issues about the First Amendment. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.